Is the United States and Iran destined for conflict? Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I'm going to talk about the increasing, intensifying conflict between the United States and Iran. Two things in particular have prompted this video. The first is Biden's Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, has come out and warned that Iran is now just weeks away from enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon, but also an inquiry along these lines from one of our viewers. This comes from West Aussie 1982. Afternoon, Dangerous Policy. Afternoon. Are you able to do a video explaining the reason why the USA and Iran relations are so sour? Alternately, why barely any Muslim countries complain about the ethnic Muslim Uyghur treatment by China when most of them openly condemn Israel about the Palestinians? It seems like a double standard. Well, on the Uyghur question, the short answer is that interests often trump brotherhood in this particular case, but each Islamic country has its own policy towards the Uyghur question, so I will go into that at a later date. But on the Iran situation, this has been a long-running story over many decades, and to explain it properly, we have to go all the way back to the 1950s. Back at that time, the United States saw the world in bipolar terms. That is, pro-democratic, pro-Western lead of the West, and then communist, Marxist, pro-Soviet proletariat in the East. And you were either communist or anti-communist. Now, in the anti-communist camp was the leader of what was then Persia, Persia being the British name for Iran, the Shah. He was a staunch American ally, very pro-business, pro-export, but he had a premier who rose to power, Mossadegh, who was a staunch ultranationalist, and he wanted to nationalize the oil industry. He wanted to kick out all these foreign influences, including American companies, and the CIA and British intelligence assessed that Mossadegh was actually a pro-Soviet sympathizer. Once he had obtained control over these means of production, he would bring Iran into the pro-Soviet sphere. They didn't want that to happen, and neither did the Shah. The Shah dismissed Mossadegh. However, a massive protest movement erupted in the streets. The Shah was forced to reappoint Mossadegh. The Shah then left Iran for quote-unquote medical reasons. And then the CIA, through a series of co-options, bribery and threats, organized a coup against Mossadegh, overthrowing the democratically elected Iranian government in favor of re-establishing the Shah. Subsequently, the Shah remained a staunch pro-American ally up until his overthrow in 1979 by their theocratic Shia Ayatollah. And now we have a theocracy in Iran led by the Ayatollah Khomeini, who has been in power since the revolution. And that revolution was particularly toxic for relations between Iran and the United States. The Iranians took hostages of American diplomats at the US Embassy in Tehran, famously kind of saved through some of the actions of the Canadian ambassador who hid them and smuggled them out of the country. And this happened right in the middle of Jimmy Carter's trying to re-election bid. Jimmy Carter handled that very poorly, and that was one of the reasons why President Carter was voted out of office in favor of the staunchly anti-Soviet Ronald Reagan. Then in the 1980s, there was the Iran-Iraq War. This was an incredibly savage conflict, totally inhumane on both sides, massive atrocities, use of chemical weapons, all kinds of terrible things occurred on both sides. And yet the United States was a strong supporter of Iraq in that conflict, backing Saddam Hussein with logistics, and munitions, chemicals, and a lot of intelligence. And that allowed Iraq to fight Iran to a standstill, massive stalemate that permanently ruptured relations between those two countries. Now, Iraq is the other Shia majority country in that region. So the most powerful Shia majority country is Iran, followed by Iraq. But Iraq under Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athist Party was a Sunni government, a secularist Sunni government ruling over a Shia majority. So the Sunnis, broadly speaking, believe that the inheritance of Islam, taking the movement forward, spreading of Islam, should be left to local leaders and respected imams, whereas the Shia see that the true inheritors of Islam and the movement are the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad himself. Of course, I'm massively oversimplifying here, but roughly around the world, 8 out of 10 Muslims are Sunni, and the remainder are Shia. Now, the Shia Muslims are predominant in Iran and Iraq. When the United States went into Iraq in 2003 and overthrew Saddam Hussein, they removed the strongest roadblock preventing the expansion of Iranian power in the region. And not only that, by removing the Ba'athist Party and all the public service apparatus that were Sunni, that allowed the Shia majority to take over the arms of government and come under the influence of their religious brethren in Iran. So it was a catastrophic strategic disaster. Not only was Iraq a massive quagmire on its own in terms of going in and it being hailed as liberators and creating this massive wave of democracy across the Middle East, none of that happened. Instead, the United States was locked in a quagmire for many years and lost thousands of lives and trillions of dollars. But also strategically, it was an error because it allowed Iran to massively expand its power. I should also note that there was a window for that to be halted, because at the time, the Iranians were terrified of the United States. Remember, George W. Bush announced the axis of evil, that being North Korea, Iraq, and Iran. And when Bush went into Iraq, the Iranians sort of asked the question, what do we take from that? The American response was, we'll take a number, i.e., you're next. And so the Iranians put forward a proposal to the American government, George W. Bush, saying, look, we see that you've gone into Iraq. We will make a grand bargain. We will support the stabilization of Iraq. We'll use our influence in Iraq to support American objectives and American interests. We will freeze and dismantle our entire nuclear program, being at that stage just roughly 10 centrifuges. By comparison, that went up to some 22,000 centrifuges by sort of 10 years later. But at the time, it was just a nascent nuclear program, and they were going to dismantle that completely in exchange for guarantees, roughly, of Iranian interests and protection of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Americans rejected that proposal, and that proved to be disastrous because the Iranians then doubled down on their nuclear program, fearing what would happen to them unless they had nuclear weapons. Remembering that Gaddafi was also overthrown and killed in 2011 after he gave up his WMD program. So the Iranians took a lesson from that. And also the belief that Iraq did not have nuclear weapons prompted the invasion of Iraq, and the belief that if Iraq did have nuclear weapons, Saddam Hussein would have been safe. So with all of that kind of belief, that really spurred the Iranian nuclear program onward, not necessarily to create a nuclear weapon outright, but to have the capacity to build one at short notice should they feel the need arise. As the Americans got bogged down in Iraq and the American public turned away from foreign intervention and became much more isolationist, the Iranians realized that they were starting to get away with this. What's more, even though Iran was massively in violation of its NPT obligations, committing all kinds of things that went beyond the realms of civilian nuclear programming. They had implosion chambers, they had all kinds of military experimentation, and yet the leader of the IAEA at the time, an Egyptian was absolutely fearful of another American intervention in the Middle East and refused during his entire time in office, no matter what evidence was presented to him about Iranian violations, to say that Iran was in non-compliance with its NPT obligations, which could potentially open the door to American intervention militarily. Now, of course, he never realized that that wasn't his job. In fact, his job was to assess whether or not the Iranians were in compliance with the NPT. He failed to do that because he was concerned about American adventurism. So that's kind of an aside, but an interesting part of the story. Another correlate to this is the Israelis. So with the removal of Saddam Hussein and the spread of Iranian influence across Iraq, there is a real risk of Iranian hegemony across the Middle East. And the ones that fear that the most are the Israelis, because unlike their other neighbors like the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the other Sunni countries, Saudi Arabia, the Israelis have a genuine and legitimate fear that the Iranians would, if they were able, make good on their threat and remove Israel completely from the Middle East. And that the way in which Iran might be able to do that is if it had an advanced nuclear program. So the Israelis look at the Iranians, their spread of influence across Iraq, their influence with Hezbollah, other militant terrorist organizations, their influence with Hamas, and then also their nuclear program with dismay and increasing disquiet. So the Israelis are deeply concerned about this, and they felt quite betrayed by President Obama, who they saw as having a distinctly pro-Iranian program. That is supporting a nuclear deal with Iran, which now I can do a whole video on that specific deal. In fact, I'm sure I will at some stage, which basically I'll kick the can down the road for 8 years with Iran. Would have prevented Iran from building a nuclear weapon, but not dismantling their nuclear infrastructure with an extraordinary amount of sanctions relief, including on military technologies across the board, kind of opening up of relations with all of the EU, with China, with Russia, for basically very little in return. So the Iranian deal was an absolute windfall for Tehran, and it is unsurprising that when President Trump was elected, and I think any Republican leader would have done the same thing, they tore it up. That went back to the way things were. So you've got the Israelis who are absolutely terrified of Iran. They saw President Obama ship like a $1.4 billion in cash pallets on a plane from the United States to Tehran. And then also at the invitation of the Republicans in Congress, not the US government itself under the presidency, but the Republicans invited the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, to deliver a speech in Congress. And that really outlined the partisan difference between President Obama's policy towards Iran and Netanyahu himself. So the Democrats have become much more lukewarm towards Israel as a whole. They're suspicious of the Israeli lobby, and they are sympathetic to the narrative that Iran had a government that was democratically elected, toppled by the CIA, and that they have legitimate fears from Saudi Arabia and others in the Middle East. Now, my own view is staunchly against that. What you have in Iran is a theocratic dictatorship, one that is expanding its influence using violence across the Middle East. It is building a nuclear program in direct violation of the NPT, and is getting away with all kinds of things that no modern state should be able to get away with, and is also killing Americans. The IEDs, you would recall all of that period in which in Afghanistan, in Iraq, most American fatalities were coming from these improvised explosive devices. Well, they're all manufactured in Iran and shipped to Afghanistan and Iraq. So the Americans have legitimate grievances towards Iran. There's also America's other allies who are deeply afraid, also not just Israel, but Saudi Arabia, Jordan, they're concerned about the expansion of Shia influence in the Middle East because Iran is regionally powerful, particularly with its growing influence in Iraq, and America's increasing distraction from the Middle East away from things like the rise of China and the influence of Russia. The Middle East has gone from the absolute focus of American foreign policy to a tertiary issue. Now, I think that is entirely appropriate. China is the biggest challenge in the United States, and the US does have to pivot away from other areas in order to focus on this hegemonic threat. But nevertheless, when you've got a rising Iran on the one hand and a withdrawing superpower ally in the other, that makes the regional powers extremely nervous, and they're exercising more and more influence in Washington to try and make sure that the US stays engaged and is willing to stand up to Iran in perpetuity. Iran also provides a useful boogeyman for the US to place troops and infrastructure in places where they would otherwise have a difficult explanation for doing so. For example, in Eastern Europe, having a lot of radars and air defense systems, they can say it's against the increasing missile threat from Iran when everyone knows full well it's to guard against Russia, and so on. So there's that as well. But primarily, there is a history that goes right back to the 1950s, a lot of depth of feeling on both sides. And then, of course, the massive escalation that occurred in January of 2020 when President Trump authorized the targeted killing of the leader of the Quds forces, Qasem Soleimani. That he was a beloved figure within the leadership of Iran. Every Iranian felt, there's a quote that every Iranian felt safer knowing that he was out there defending them. Of course, he was a terrorist. He would kill people indiscriminately. He thought he was safe, and the Americans rightly targeted him. But nevertheless, from the Iranian perspective, he was a hero of the Islamic Republic, and thus they are very likely to seek to avenge his death. Also, there's a kind of a personal insult factor that he was a senior political figure as well as being the leader of the Quds forces, and thus they see that almost as a political assassination as well. Where do I think all this is going? Well, American policy under the Democrats has been somewhat different to that of the Republicans, and certainly different to the Israelis. The Israelis have a policy that Iran will not have the ability to make a nuclear weapon. That's Israel's policy. The Democrats' policy has been no weapon, right? So these are quite different policies. The Israelis want the Iranians to not have a nuclear program at all, and the American Democratic Party sees that the Iranian nuclear program has some legitimacy. I do not, but they do. And they think that as long as Iran doesn't take that final step to developing a nuclear bomb, then that's okay. Now, I think that that's absurd. If you've got all the fissile material for a nuclear weapon, all the highly enriched uranium you could ever desire, but the actual manufacture of a nuclear device for a country like Iran would be relatively trivial, and then they could do that at fairly short notice. So I don't think that that is a viable long-term policy, but nevertheless, that is the policy that President Obama pursued, and likely one that Biden will as well. Whether or not the Israelis could live with such a policy is another question, and there is the potential that Israel, independently of the United States, could launch a military strike, a large-scale military strike on Iran. Now, the challenge has been that Israeli jets don't have the range to reach the range of targets necessary, and thus would need some refueling support, most likely, most obviously, from the United States itself, but potentially the Saudis as well might provide that support. And once Israel attacks Iran and there was a genuine conflict in the Middle East, then the United States has to back Israel regardless. So that may well be playing into the Israelis' mind. While President Trump was in power, the Israelis felt secure. They felt like America had their back, that America wasn't going to allow Iran to get away with anything. It's very unlikely that under President Obama's former vice president, that they will feel the same way. They were deeply nervous under Obama. They were very relieved when President Trump was elected. And it's also possible that they will actually initiate a military conflict in the months and years to come to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon, with the expectation that once such a conflict erupted, the United States would have no choice but to back Israel. The problem is that this would not be a slam dunk. Although, of course, the difference in military power between the United States and Iran is vast, one can expect China and Russia to wrap their hands together with glee at the prospect of getting America bogged down in yet another Middle East conflict, one in which the Chinese and Russians would be supporting the Iranian government with barely a scarce even attempt at veiling their activities. So that would be an extraordinary quagmire to get into. I don't know what the solution is, though, because it is unacceptable for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. I've written extensively on the risk of Iran having a nuclear weapon, even if they didn't use it to attack Israel, what that would mean for Iran seeing itself having a green light to massively ramp up its support for terrorist organizations around the world, and the complete checkmating of Israel in many respects, because Israel doesn't have very much territory, and despite the fact that it has an enormous conventional military and strongly suspected a significant nuclear deterrent, the risk to it is grave, even from a small number of nuclear devices. So I think that as long as the Ayatollah remains in power, and so long as that they deny Israel's right to exist, their absolute belief in the destruction of the United States, and their continuing support for terrorism and expansion of conflict in Shia-dominated areas or in Lebanon and other places in the region, then the potential for conflict between the United States and Iran remains grave. That's my view. Please, leave your own comments down below. I would love to continue this discussion on this issue, but you can see that this goes back a long way. The Iranian government has its narrative about what's happened in the past, and irrespective of whether some of that is legitimate, that doesn't legitimize their current activities. That's just my view, and I'm also concerned about the democratic policy towards Iran. I think the Republicans were more effective, even if tearing up the Iranian nuclear deal has accelerated the nuclear program in some ways. Thanks very much, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.